Once again, good day ladies and gentlemen. On your screens is still Andy Little, taking you through transport economics as a fundamental tool for economic growth and development. We've covered Learning Unit 1, which was a brief and somewhat of a foundation for the module. We'll continue with our journey onto Learning Unit 2 of the module, which is a topic speaking of demand and supply of transportation. In this topic, the learning objectives are as follows. Explain what is meant by demand for transport. Describe the different types of utility which transport offers to consumers. Elaborate on the factors impacting demand for transport. Discuss the role of transportation in facilitating global trade. Explain freight demand. Discuss service components of freight demand. Describe what is meant by supply of transport. This is a brief introduction of the topic. As an economic tool, transport requires infrastructure, vessels, aircraft, and vehicles to move people as well as goods from point of origin to the point of destination. Transportation is defined as a market that is made up of suppliers of transport services as well as users of that transport service. In an ideal world, the transport market should always aim for market equilibrium, which is where basically the quantity of transport demanded is equal to that of supplied quantity of transport. As it is clearly displayed, transport demand is generated by the need or requirement to move people and freight. The need for transport. The inevitable significance of transport has made it a need, as it has become an integral part of the daily life of all South Africans. Further to that, the demand for transport shapes the urban landscape and influences spatial choices made by people in relation to where they work, where they live, and the schools they attend. Businesses also make choices on where to set up shop based on market proximity and mobility of labor, as well as goods and services. Now we look at aggregate demand. As you have seen in the previous display of the aggregate supply and aggregate demand model, as a principle, the aggregate demand curve is forever downward sloping. Ultimately, the aggregate supply curve, on the other hand, is forever an upward sloping curve. Further to that, the long-run aggregate demand curve is a vertical curve, as the supply in the long run is fixed irrespective of the price of the product. In this instance, the product is transport. Aggregate demand for transportation refers to the sum of individual demand for freight or for passengers. This will then allow us to understand the relationship in relation to differing demands of transport, for example, road versus rail or air, etc. Derived demand. In simple terms, derived demand basically means a demand for a good that arises due to the demand of another good in another sector. These goods are called complementary goods, an economic term that when simply defined means goods that go together. For example, shoes and shoelaces, car tires and cars, as depicted in the previous slide. Transport in itself is demanded to move goods from point of production to where they are required, or transport can be required as a means of transport to get to work, school, etc. Ultimately, an increase in the demand for car tires will lead to an increase in demand for cars and vice versa. Now we look at elasticity. Elasticity as an economic term refers to the responsiveness of consumers to a change in the price of a product. There are various types of elasticities, namely elastic, inelastic, unit elastic, etc. In this instance, transport demand is elastic. On the other hand, freight transport is inelastic, meaning it is very responsive to changes in prices and not too responsive to changes in prices respectively. The following are reasons for passenger transport to be more elastic than freight transport. These are transport mode, time of the day of the week, etc. For example, the Gautrain fares differ based on peak versus off-peak times, as well as weekend travel discounts. As such, demand for transport during the week and at peak times is very high, which is inelastic, because travelers use the Gautrain as a mode of transport to get to and from work. Now we look at the different types of utility. As we have seen that transport offers different types of utility, those being place and time and quantity utility. We will now look at what each one defines. Place utility could be defined as the making of goods available as the place which they are required. For example, wine is produced in the Cape but transported all over the country and internationally because of their ability to be transported. Time utility, on the other hand, refers to the utility associated with the purchasing of goods at a certain time. For example, during Easter holidays, transportation of Easter eggs and hot cross buns make it possible for consumers to get the goods at various shopping stores. The last utility is known as quantity utility, which is aided by the transportation, as the latter makes it possible for goods to be delivered where they are required in the required quantity. In simple terms, utility means satisfaction. Now we turn our attention to passenger demand for transport, which refers to people that travel to work, school, or where they reside, etc. on a constant basis. Aggregate demand, which is also referred to as total demand for passenger transport, can be defined as the sum of total demand for different modes of transport or one particular mode. Further to the above mentioned and described, we have modal split, which refers to dividing the total transportation market for passenger or freight movement according to the use or volume by the major modes of transportation, such as private motor vehicles, buses, and trains. Having recently described what the term modal split refers to, we now look at it in the South African context. Over 2 decades ago, South Africans have become relatively more mobile and dependent on transport. There has been a continuous increase in the use of buses and taxis. However, taxis remain the more commonly used public transport in the country of South Africa across all provinces. However, in the Western Cape and Gauteng, trains are primarily used to work and education-related travel. For the next few slides, we will be diving into the factors and explaining some of them. These factors are household disposable income, The number of journeys for business and recreational purposes also increases as income increases. Population and household size, age distribution, gender distribution, labor force participation, education level, and ethnicity. Population density, the location of activities, communication patterns, time routines, availability of a private mode of transport, availability of public modes, infrastructure and vehicle capacity, service characteristics, travel costs, and travel time. We will now look at the following few to be described. The first one is age distribution. Often in developed countries, there are more older people than there are young people. This could be due to increased life expectancy. Further to that, older people, approximately 55 and older, usually travel more than the youth. This could be due to better health as well as generous donations, which refers to the point about income as an impacting factor for transport demand. We now look at gender distribution, labor force participation, education level, and ethnicity. The factors listed above have an influence on the transport volume as well as the chosen mode of transport. It should also be known that female participation in the labor force has increased over the years, which is likely to increase car ownership. The more qualified you are, the more specialized your work becomes, which would then often mean that you would have to travel further to your respective place of work. Race and ethnicity can also increase travel demand, such as in the case of South Africa, where apartheid spatial planning forced people of color to live in townships away from city centers. This continues to increase demand for travel by Black African people into city centers from outlying areas like Soweto. Population density. This refers to the number of people living in each unit area, such as square meters. Population density is also a strong determinant of motorization and journey lengths. Population density differs from city to city as well as areas. In some cases, high densities discourage car ownership due to congestion, parking problems, and greater availability of alternative transport. Time routines. These are routines related to departure time, the time of arrival, as well as the rush hour times. The prior mentioned determined how congested roads are at certain times of the day. For example, in Pretoria, roads are congested in the mornings when people are traveling to work and afternoon when they have knocked off and heading home. Further to that, increase in shopping hours can decrease traffic during rush hour. Now we look at freight definition. Freight refers to goods or cargo carried by a ship, airplane, truck, or train, such as coal, cement, steel, etc. Simply put, the carrying of goods from one place to another, as by airplane, we say the goods were shipped by freight. Now we look at freight corridors in South Africa. South African transport networks move about 900 million metric tons of cargo per annum. This requires efficient roads as well as rail and port facilities. The approximated contribution of the freight logistics to South Africa is 13.5%. The interdependence between countries. Freight transport is important to facilitate trade between different countries. South Africa, for instance, supplies the rest of the world with goods like gold, platinum, iron ore, and other minerals, while it imports some of the goods like electronics. Now we turn our attention to service components of the freight demand. The varying requirements that customers have when it comes to freight transport may require special services such as having goods picked up and delivered at a specific time, special security services, etc. The service components are listed below. These components are transit time, accessibility, reliability, capability, and security. We will now describe one of them, that one being accessibility. Accessibility as one of these components means the ability of a transport provider to move goods between two required destinations. While transport demand tends to vary and is not consistent, the supply of transport is, however, fixed. When demand is lower than supply, transit times are stable and predictable, since the existing infrastructure can support the load. Whilst on the other hand, when demand for transport is greater than supply over a period of time, congestion results. Transport supply refers to the capacity of transportation infrastructure and modes over a period of time. Supply of transport is now what we'll be looking at. As seen in the previous graph, the market forces of demand and supply, as far as transport is concerned, interact with one another until equilibrium is reached at that price. However, changes in price may affect the demand for transport, which may result to demanding other modes of transport routes, as well as travel times. The two markets referred to are known as third-party transportation and own account transportation. The latter is defined as a consumer using its own transport to move themselves or their goods from one place to another, for instance, using their own car. The prior refers to an agreement on terms and conditions between a company and a user, for instance, DHL. Now we look at modal and intermodal supply. Modal supply refers to the supply of one transport mode affecting the others. For example, trucks and cars use the same infrastructure, which is road. This makes the relationship between the two inversely proportional. Alternatively, intermodal supply means the using of different modes of transport to move goods from one place to another. For road, rail, and telecommunications, transport supply is often dependent on capacity of the routes and vehicles. This is speaking to modal supply. While for air and maritime transportation, the supply of transport is influenced by capacity of the terminals. This speaks to intermodal transport. This brings us to the end of the chapter on demand and supply of transport. We will now turn our attention to transport policy and regulation as our third chapter of this module. See you very, very soon.